Hello everyone, Dr. Mike here, TCOM 101. In this video, we're going to start talking about some of the economic issues related to the telecommunications industries, the media, and the tech industries. So we're going to be talking about capitalism and companies, corporations, how they're organized, and what their business strategies are. That's what we'll be talking about in the next few videos. Now, you know the coronavirus has had sweeping effects on the media industries, especially the global film and television industries. They've had to shut down productions, and theaters all over the world have been closed. Okay, so we've got shuttered cinemas, low attendance, Hollywood films being postponed or being released on streaming platforms instead of in the theater. And production was shut down. Now it's starting to come back, but even some of the scripts are changed. I've read that there's less kissing and intimacy and even less fisticuffs, fighting in the scripts in an attempt to keep a little social distancing to protect the actors. But Hollywood has taken a big blow from the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. Now let's start talking a little about the big media companies, the mega media giants. These are the companies that produce much of the media content, the films, the TV show, the cable entertainment. Much of the content, the news that we see today is controlled by a handful of giant mega media companies. So according to the Fortune 500, okay, the Fortune 500 is a list of the biggest companies, and it's based on one particular metric called annual revenue or sales or income. This is the money that a company takes in, the revenue that it pulls in a 12-month period. So according to that measure, the largest media company in America, and indeed the world, is the Mouse, the Walt Disney Company, which has annual revenue of about $60 billion. Okay, now some of the other media companies on this list are in fact owned by larger corporations. For example, NBC Universal is owned by Comcast, the big cable company, and Warner Media is owned by AT&T, the big phone company. But these are some of the major media companies, and they're producing the content that we absorb every day. Now let's talk about some of the economic issues. The first one I want to talk about is ownership. Who owns the media? Okay, now what we're going to talk about is concentration of ownership, because concentration of ownership is a major issue, controversial issue. Not only among the media companies, but right now, but especially among the tech giants. Okay, but let's look at the patterns of electronic media ownership. Think of all the media, the newspapers, the websites, the film studios, the TV production companies, the radio companies. Who owns all of the media, the TV industry? Well, there are several different ways or patterns or ways to talk about ownership. Now, the original model really in the United States was independent ownership. A lot of small, independent, locally owned, sometimes family owned, mom and pop sort of independent ownership of media outlets like TV stations, radio stations, movie theaters. Okay, but today we're not very likely to see a lot of independent voices and ownership. What we're more likely to see is big media ownership, which could take the form of a group or a chain. This is a chain of the same kind of media companies, like a chain of radio stations or a chain of TV stations. Okay, or we're likely to see a conglomerate. A conglomerate is a giant diversified companies that owns a lot of different kinds of businesses, and maybe those include a bunch of different media properties. But what we're likely to see today is less independent ownership and more big media, either group or conglomerate ownership. Now that shouldn't surprise us. Concentration of ownership, that always happens in a capitalistic economy. We always see concentration of ownership until the government steps in to break it up. And that has happened many times in the history of our country, where the government has stepped in to break up concentration of ownership. In the United States, it's called antitrust law. It's a collection of federal and state laws that regulates the conduct and organization of business corporations. The whole idea of antitrust is to promote competition for the benefit of the consumers. The consumer here is the ultimate stakeholder, not the company and the investors. Okay, so the main federal statutes that govern antitrust are the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the Clayton Act of 1914, and the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. But this has set up an apparatus within the government to go after giant industries and too much concentration of ownership and power. Okay. And we have a long history of antitrust action. It goes back to Theodore Roosevelt, who was really one of the big proponents of breaking up some of the giant trust and corporations of his day. Anyway, who does this at the federal government? It's the Justice Department. The Justice Department is responsible for enforcing the antitrust laws in the United States. And again, the goal is to protect some economic freedom and opportunity by promoting free and fair competition. Fair competition in the marketplace. Did you know the DOJ, the Department of Justice, just filed antitrust action against Google, the tech giant, saying that it does not engage in fair competition. Anyway, the Department of Justice is the branch of the federal government that looks at issues of concentration of ownership. It's not the only agency, but it's the primary one. Now, what the Justice Department is trying to prevent is a monopoly, when one company owns too much of the share of a marketplace. Okay, you're familiar with this board game. Interestingly, it goes back to the Great Depression, but you've played this and you get the basic concept here in capitalism. You try and form a monopoly and to destroy your competition so you can control the entire market. Now, how big a share of the market do you have to have before you're approaching monopoly? Well, it's all in the eye of the beholder. I think when you're above 80-90%, you're definitely getting at a monopoly. If you're controlling 60 or 70% of a market share, well, some people will still say that's too much, that stifles competition. But definitely 80-90% of a market share is certainly close to monopoly. So a monopoly exists when one single firm dominates an industry. We have a few pure monopolies. Really, think about Google and search. Okay, it's like 95% of all searches are done through Google. What about Microsoft and its operating system, Windows? 95% of all PCs that aren't Apple, but normal, traditional PCs use Windows. Satellite radio. There's one company, a monopoly in the satellite radio industry. So we do have some monopolies in TCOM. Okay, and sometimes the government will come in and break up monopolies. For example, in the 1980s, the government forced the breakup or the divestiture of AT&T. Up until that time, there was one company, a monopoly, that controlled all phone service, local and long-distance phone service in the United States. But the federal government came in and broke it up into several smaller companies in the 1980s. In the 1990s, we saw the big antitrust suit against Microsoft. The Department of Justice actually thought about breaking up Microsoft into several companies because of some of its business practices that had led it to have dominant shares of things like, at one time, the browser market, the web browsing market, or certainly the operating system market. The federal government ultimately did not break up Microsoft, but it warned it to engage in more fair business practices. The government did break up Paramount Pictures in the 1940s. This was a famous case involving, which we'll talk about more later, but it involved who can own a movie studio and the movie theaters in which the films are exhibited and displayed. Well, a lot of people think that that gives a film studio too much power if it also owns all of the movie theaters. So there was a famous Supreme Court case in which the federal government, the Supreme Court, made Paramount Pictures sell off all of the theaters that it owned. Okay, it forced the divestiture of Paramount Pictures. Also in the 1940s, the federal government actually forced the breakup or the divestiture of NBC. This was in the popular stage of radio, and NBC was the dominant company, and it had way too much power in the opinion of some people. So the federal government forced NBC to break up, and that's how we got ABC. ABC came out of the divestiture or the breakup of NBC back in the 1940s. Now, we're going to see more of this coming. The government, I think, in the next few years, especially after the election, will focus on Facebook and Amazon and maybe Apple and certainly Google, okay, Alphabet. And I predict that there will be serious efforts to try and break these companies up, these tech giants, because they control enormous shares of different marketplaces. So I think it's a pretty safe bet that we'll see the federal government target the tech giants in the next few years. I hope you're getting something out of this lecture. I'm proud of you for being socially responsible and wearing a mask and social distancing and doing all those other good behaviors right now. All right. Now, we'll occasionally see a monopoly, but we're much more likely to see an oligopoly. Okay, an oligopoly exists when just a handful of companies dominate an industry. When a handful of companies, we see this a lot, the phone companies, the car companies, and especially the media companies. I think the electronic media industry in the 21st century is really dominated by a handful of giant companies, global media conglomerates, an oligopoly of global media conglomerates. These are huge corporations like Disney, which own a whole range of companies involved in media and entertainment. Okay, mega media conglomerates. In fact, I think there's basically 6 of them that control most of what America sees, hears, reads every day. And the people that run these companies are like the ministers of culture. They give the green lights. They make the decisions about the movies, the TV shows, the websites, and the other content, the news and the other content, sports, all of it, okay, in many ways is determined by the executives at these 6 media giants: Disney, NBC Universal, Warner Media, Viacom, CBS, Sony, and Fox. And so I think it's important to understand these companies. Now, they're all really conglomerates. And a conglomerate is just a diversified corporation. It's a corporation, a company that's made up of a number of different companies that are diversified. They operate in diverse fields. So it's a complex, diversified company. So why would you diversify? Well, here's one reason. Okay, by diversifying, a big company can protect itself against changing markets and economic conditions. Look at the current situation with the virus and a big media company like Disney. Well, its film production business may be hurting right now. Definitely the theme parks and resorts are hurting right now. But there's one part of Disney that's making money and growing right now and keeping the company alive. And that's the streaming marketplace, the direct-to-consumer marketplace. Okay, Disney Plus and its other streaming services. That's what's really keeping Disney protecting itself right now. Okay, media companies also try to create what are called profitable media synergy. Synergy is really an amazing concept. Synergy. That's the cooperative interaction among the subsidiaries of a company that creates a big enhanced combined effect. That's what synergy is, a giant enhanced combined effect. So maybe you've got different parts of the company working together. The easiest example I can give you of a synergy is the film and the movie soundtrack. Both of those work together to create a bigger profit, an enhanced combined effect than either item could do on its own. Now, Disney is the master of synergy. Think of it also as information packaging. You can take one intellectual concept and you can package it in different ways. You can package it as a movie, as a TV show. You can put it on Hollywood or on ice, a theme park attraction, character merchandise, a video game. There's a lot of ways you can package intellectual property to create synergies. Now, let's drill down a little bit on the big six media conglomerates, the big, giant, mega media conglomerates. Warner Media is one of them. Warner Media is a fascinating company. It owns all the Turner Broadcasting properties, so that includes CNN and Turner Classic Movies and the Cartoon Network and TBS and TNT, some major cable TV channels. One of its biggest assets is Home Box Office, the giant cable company that's now also getting into streaming. Warner Media, of course, owns Warner Brothers Entertainment, which makes films, incredible films and TV shows. So Warner Media owns a bunch of interesting media brands like HBO and Warner Brothers Pictures, and of course the Turner properties, Cartoon Network, CNN, Turner Classic Movies, and so on. Now, the head of Warner Media, the CEO, the big cheese, the chief executive officer is a man named John Stankey. And these gentlemen, these executives are very important, okay, because like I said, they make the decisions about the content that we see. Now, the big shakeup at Warner Media was when a couple of years ago it was acquired by AT&T. AT&T spent $85 billion to buy this company, Time Warner, which it renamed Warner Media. Okay? Warner Media is really owned by AT&T, the phone giant. Okay, this merger is called vertical integration. It combines one of the biggest distribution companies, that's AT&T, with one of the biggest producers of TV and movies. This is a deliberate business strategy. It's called vertical integration. It's trying to control both the content and the means by which the content is distributed. Okay, vertical integration, important strategy. It concentrates media ownership by acquiring companies that are in closely related businesses. For example, program production and distribution. So the AT&T Warner Media merger is a great example of vertical integration. Let's talk about the mouse, Walt Disney. Okay, this is a company that many people love and hate. And the company is broken into several segments. The media networks, that's the real profit center, especially ESPN. But ABC and ESPN are major brands owned by Disney. Disney also has the parks and the consumer products. It also controls a number of different film studios. And of course, it has a new segment called Direct to Consumer, the streaming segment that includes Disney Plus. Okay, so Walt Disney is the biggest media conglomerate in the world. I mean, it owns ABC and ESPN, major media networks, the Disney Channel, but it also owns some of the most important film studios in the world, like Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilm, that's the Star Wars franchise, Fox, which it acquired recently, and of course it's launched this incredible streaming service, Disney Plus. Okay, now Disney has a new CEO, Chief Executive Officer, or Big Cheese at the mouse. It's Bob Chapek. He replaced a brilliant businessman named Bob Iger, who we'll talk more about when I do an in-depth profile of the Walt Disney Corporation. Now, the big recent acquisition that Disney made was purchasing a lot of the media and TV entertainment content from Fox. Okay, so in 2017, we saw a deal proposed. Walt Disney would acquire a lot of the assets of 20th Century Fox. Now, why? Because Disney wants to become a leader in streaming. It wants all of that 20th Century Fox library of TV shows and movies and content so that it can use that content as part of its streaming model. The Disney Fox deal is really an example of horizontal integration. Okay, the Disney film studios were there, but they've added a few more film studios. So horizontal integration is how you concentrate ownership by buying up companies that are in the same business. So maybe you own a handful of movie studios or internet firms or a bunch of radio stations or cable outlets. Okay, this is called horizontal integration. And the Fox Disney deal is a great example of that. Now, the Department of Justice, the antitrust regulators, approved this deal in 2019. Okay? We'll talk more about that giant deal when I do an in-depth profile of Disney. Now, let's talk a little bit about Viacom CBS. This is an over-the-air network and really a cable company and a film company. So Viacom owns Paramount Pictures, a major film studio, but also some really important cable channels like Comedy Central and the MTV family and the BET family of channels and the VH1 family of channels. It's also into the children's programming with TV Land and Nickelodeon. And Paramount Pictures, the big film studio, is at the heart of Viacom CBS. CBS includes an outdoor advertising company, a radio network, book publishing, of course, CBS News, CBS Sports. Showtime is another big part of the portfolio of Viacom CBS. Later, you'll have to profile a TCOM company, and Viacom CBS might be a very interesting one. The current CEO at Viacom CBS is a man named Bob Bacchus. These are highly paid, highly compensated CEOs and executives. Let's talk a little bit about Fox. Even though it sold off most of its entertainment and TV production assets to Disney, it still remains as a big company that touches a lot of Americans every day. Fox includes, of course, the Fox Entertainment Network, the Fox TV network, the very popular Fox Sports networks, FS1, okay, the Fox Business Channel, okay, the Fox News Channel, a very important news network. And it still owns a number of TV stations. And if that's not enough, throw in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post and a number of important publications, newspapers. Okay. So the Fox empire still exists, although they sold The Simpsons and a bunch of other properties over to Disney. The head of Fox, the CEO, is Lachlan Murdoch. He's the son of the original founder of the Fox empire, Rupert Murdoch. All right, let's talk a little bit about NBC Universal, which is owned by Comcast, the nation's #1 cable company and broadband provider. So this is another example of vertical integration, controlling both the content production and the channels for the distribution of the content. Now, this merger took place in 2013, just a few years ago, but Comcast decided to purchase NBC Universal to become more vertically integrated. Let's focus in on the NBC Universal division, okay? NBC Universal Media. So this includes a number of important assets. Of course, the NBC TV network, NBC News, NBC Sports, USA Today, a cable channel, CNBC, MSNBC, another news channel, Telemundo, a Spanish language network. Of course, the Universal Studios, the theater, the film production, but also those great theme parks and resorts, okay, and some other properties. But NBC Universal, a major player owned by Comcast. The head of NBC Universal, the CEO, there is Steve Burke. Steve Burke. Now, a couple of other major companies include Sony, the Japanese company, and Bertelsmann, okay, which is a German kind of media conglomerate. Okay, Bertelsmann used to own a huge amount of the American music industry, the Bertelsmann Music Group, but it sold most of that to Sony, the Japanese, conglomerate. Sony does play an important role here in America. The CEO is Kenichiro Yoshida. He's the big cheese, the CEO at Sony. How does Sony touch our lives? Well, they own a major film studio, Sony Pictures and Columbia Pictures. They own one of the biggest music companies in the world, Sony Music. Okay, they sell a lot of consumer electronics, including the PlayStation, which I believe it's coming out with its 5th version here shortly, PS5. Okay, so that's a summary of kind of the big media conglomerates that exist. In the next video, we'll focus in a little bit on the big tech giants and some of the big service providers, the phone companies. All right, so we'll talk about those next time. Until then, please continue to take care of yourself and each other and the members of the entire Ball State community. I will see you soon. So long, everybody.